Hi, welcome again to the best year of your life. I'm here with Dr. Ron Siegel, an assistant professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School, where he has taught for over 35 years. Dr. Siegel teaches internationally about mind body medicine and the application of mindfulness and compassion practices in psychotherapy and other fields. He also has a private clinical practice. Welcome, Dr. Siegel. I am so glad to be here with you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, today we're focused on relationships. Do you think that relationships are important for a good life? And if so, why?
I do out of personal experience, but also because we are lucky that we now have empirical data supporting this. There's a wonderful study that's been done here at Harvard that was started in 1938 called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. And what they did was they started with some 700 odd men. Harvard was all men back then. And half of them were Harvard undergraduates, and half of them were poor kids, young adults from Boston neighborhoods. And they have been following them ever since. Some 60 of these folks are still alive. And early on, they did some interviews. They did a little bit of testing with the equipment that was available in the 30s to see, blood pressure and things like that. But they've gotten increasingly refined over the years, checking everything from lipid levels and inflammation in the body to issues such as, how they get along with other people, their moods, their productivity, all of these kinds of things. So they have tremendous amount of data on these folks for decades and decades. And a friend of mine, Bob Waldinger, Dr. Bob Waldinger, who's a interesting fellow because he's both a psychiatrist and a Zen priest. You don't see
Oh, wow.
that too often. A Harvard psychiatrist, no less. And he's been put in charge of the study in recent years, and he's declared we now know what's important for a good life, both in terms of longevity as well as in terms of well-being, and it's the quality of our relationships. And the interesting thing about this study is that, and I found this deeply relieving, that the relationships don't have to be entirely harmonious. Like, it's okay if you bicker with your husband or wife or siblings or parents or children. What's critical for both longevity as well as for having a life that feels meaningful and for happiness is that the relationships feel trustworthy, that it feel like other people have our back and we would have their back, not necessarily during the argument, but at least if push came to shove and we're in danger. So we know empirically now that relationships are super important, and it kind of buttresses what we know intuitively, which is when our relationships are going well, we're happier. When they're not going so well, we're not as happy. And this all makes perfect sense because we are such social primates. This is, you look at any other primate group and they are always in a small group. They're always interacting. They're always either arguing or preening one another, or picking out tasty little bugs and eating them. Not exactly like this is who we are. So
Right.
so it makes a lot of sense.
That's great. So it sounds like it's really important. But if I'm assuming there's members of our audience who want to enhance those relationships, whether they're primary relationships or work relationships or with their children or just all the relationships. We all have so many relationships. So where does that begin? Where does that enhancement process, that trustworthiness begin?
Yeah, I think the critical thing in making relationships work is some combination of being honest and deliberately shifting so that we care about the relationship. In doing couples therapy, which I've done over the years, often it's helpful to realize that there are three beings, if you will, in the room. There's one member of the couple, the other member of the couple, and then there's the relationship. And the relationship it's its own entity. The relationship is created out of the dynamic dance between the two of us. So the first rule of thumb is to, based on the research or based on our own experience, to realize that relationships matter. So let me put energy into taking care of this third entity. Let me put energy into taking care of this relationship. Let me not just assume that it's going to happen by itself, because it won't just happen by itself. Relationships require time and energy and care, and even conceptualizing it as a being, if you will, or an entity that needs care, starts to help us, because what it starts to do is it starts to shift us from our usual posture, which is frankly pretty self-centered. Most of us, well, maybe not the rest of you, maybe our listeners are far more spiritually advanced than I am. But if I'm honest and I notice what's going on in my mind, I'm talking to myself about myself all day long, right? Should I have the poached salmon over wilted spinach? That would be so healthy, but the lasagna looks great. How am I doing in this interview? Am I being engaging? Am I not? Thank you very much. But I'm constantly involved in basically thinking about myself and talking to myself about myself, and we doing that, which is our habit, and our brains evolved, frankly, to do that. But one of the results of that is we tend to think, number one, that we exist, of course, and number two, that we're very important. Like, obviously, I'm the hero of my story. I once heard a comedian say, I can't die. I'm the main character. Right? Because this is because where I was doing this. And to begin to see the relationship as a separate entity starts this shift that, okay, even though our natural predilection is to think about our needs and what makes me feel good, what makes me not feel good, maybe somebody that needs attention is this relationship, much in the same way that for those of us who become parents, we start to shift from what do I want to what does my kid need? And in the same way, I think we need to start making that shift from what do I want to what does this entity, the relationship, need?
That's beautiful. It's such a shift. True. I have two small children myself, so I recognize that shift that occurs, and it strikes me that that's the place also where so much of our fears come up, because as soon as we start to shift away from that completely self-centered kind of inquiry, there's this place where some of our worst tendencies can come out. I
Yeah,
mean, it's so true, I think, across the board that some of our worst behaviors come out towards those we love the most.
absolutely, absolutely.
So what can we do about that?
Well, I think it starts by understanding that. For one, thank you for naming it. Just realizing that this is natural, right? This is what it is to be human. I remember years ago reading an article is titled "Relationship: The Ship of Fools," and the idea wasn't that it's foolish to be in relationship; it's that we act quite foolishly when we're in relationships. And the more intimate the relationship, the more foolishly we act, right? We say and do things, in intimate relationships, which we'd be horrified for our professional colleagues to know about, right? Like, this is just human reality
Yeah,
for
I can
at least for
vouch.
many
That's
of us.
totally true.
Again, the rest of you may be far more advanced than I am, but after, many decades of working as a psychologist and a meditator, this is where I still am. So so why is that? What's going on here? Well, you know, for one thing, relationships tap our most passionate and deepest needs, right? We all come into this world wanting to be loved. It makes perfect sense. Again, looking at this from the lens of psychological science, there's a few aspects of this. One is, if you're a baby and you're not loved, you're in deep, deep trouble, right? Because, well, you're a mom, right? The fact that you love your kids means they're going to survive. If you didn't, they wouldn't. So we might imagine that throughout evolutionary history, there were kids who were, who came into the world who didn't have a need to be loved, but statistically, they died. They didn't get to grow up, reproduce, and pass their DNA on. The ones who survived were the ones who wanted to be loved and had some skill at evoking that loving response. So we all desperately want to feel loved. And of course, in relationships, it's very easy for things to go awry and to have moments where we're not feeling loved. And we get reactive to that. And our reactivity is often problematic. There's another thing that makes us actually quite primitive in our relationships that I don't think we talk about as much as we might. And that's that there's this peculiar relationship between intimate relationships and self-esteem. Let's just start with romantic relationships for a moment. Assuming that many of our listeners have had a romantic relationship, remember back to one of the more intense early relationships. Okay, that one, that'll do, right? We all can identify these, right? And remember how you felt about you when this other person that, and I'm going to assume that you kind of idealized, that you thought, wow, they're really special in some way. Maybe they were super bright or super gorgeous or super, sexually talented and interesting. Maybe they were caring and loving. Maybe they had great character, whatever it was about them that you thought this person is really special and is like really good in some way, kind of high status in some way, whatever our system is for evaluating that. And then they like us back or they love us back. Wow, does that feel good? Every single injury that I had in my adolescence, feeling rejected, feeling skinny, feeling not good enough, whatever it is, wiped out because this wonderful other person loves me and thinks I'm wonderful and my problems are solved. And this is why, it's so powerful for us to, initially be in one of these relationships. And of course, if we reciprocate and they think we're wonderful, then all of their problems are solved, right? That they get to feel like, finally I'm secure. Finally, I'm wonderful. Finally, all of those self-doubts are gone. And that all works quite well until something shifts and the other doesn't seem so wonderful or we don't seem so wonderful to them. Could be something like they squeezed the toothpaste tube from the middle, left the toilet seat up. There are all sorts of things that we might do to fall from grace with one another. But when we do, the whole thing starts to unravel. And then we start to crash, right? Because go back to that first relationship that was so wonderful and assuming that you're not still with that sweetheart, remember what it was like to lose them? Probably one of the most painful things that had happened up to that time. Maybe not if you had other worse trauma, but it can be pretty bad, right? And so then there's that feeling. And of course, when we move from the sort of mutual idealization club to either they're not liking me that much or I'm not liking them that much, so this isn't working anymore, we crash. And that crash is very, very painful. And we don't do well as humans in the face of really bad pain. We get reactive and we try to do things to undo it. So when we're shifting from the relationship is great to it's not so great, that's usually what brings out aspects of ourselves that aren't our most noble, aren't our most savory, because we feel quite desperate to not have that crash. And the crash can have different components. It can be either no longer feeling good about me or no longer feeling loved and lovable. And they're both super important, right? Because we're hardwired to want to feel loved and lovable, and we're hardwired to want to feel good about ourselves. And on top of just one more element, as though there weren't enough factors loading into this, if you think of our ancestors on the African savannah, to be alone there was a death sentence, right? We're social primates. We were very cooperative, and to be without that meant nobody to warn you about the lion, you're going to die, right? So even ancestrally, other than this operates both at the level of being an infant and needing to be loved, but also ancestrally, we needed to be loved. We needed to be part of the group. So when we feel we're losing that, we go ape, so to speak, and do all sorts of things that aren't our most noble. Just knowing that can be helpful. Right? Mm-hmm. Just knowing that, okay, I'm often not going to be at my best. My partner is often not going to be at their best. My sibling is often not going to be at their best. And rather than interpret it as they're no good for me or this is a terrible relationship, see if we can approach this with some sense of compassion for our common humanity and the sense that everybody is super primitive in relationships. And let's see if we can work this out. And of course, there are many tools and techniques, I think, for doing that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It sounds like, well, besides the fact that it sounds like we're basically just monkeys.
Sorry.
Right.
I know there are a lot of traditions that try to posit that we're not actually mammals, but it's hard for me to see it. I don't know.
I think people will be able to relate to that. It seems that this quality of permission to allow ourselves to be human is really key. And I'm wondering, as we're thinking about these, inevitable conflicts that arise in relationship in all the different ways, whether it's just a struggle or there's just plain unhappiness or the toothpaste problem or whatever else, we kind of lock ourselves into this place where we think we need to fix the problem. I
Yeah.
don't know anything about that, by the way. And I'm wondering, since that clearly doesn't work very well, what other approaches might we take?
Yeah.
What can we do when we find ourselves locked in that stuck place?
Sure. I think one approach, which I think is very often quite useful, is trying to understand what the other person needs to re-regulate themselves. So
Beautiful.
we're starting with a premise here that we're going to get dysregulated, right? And we're going to get dysregulated in relationship. So while, yeah, the Mutual Admiration Society might keep up for a while, and maybe you've got people who are really good at not expressing their feelings, but being very polite so that things are harmonious for a while. But sooner or later, in serious relationships, in really close relationships, we're going to hurt each other's feelings in some way. We're going to have a breach, and the other, who often seems wonderful and my great partner, is going to look not so great to us, right? That this is just going to happen. So first of all, not thinking that means I need a divorce, that means I need to never see my brother or sister again, to realize, no, this is baked in. And then to begin to inquire, and this we can do with one another, what do you need in order to re-regulate when you've gotten really upset? Because when things really go off the rails, both people are upset, right? I say something, it triggers you. You say something back, it triggers me. We escalate. You ever have one of those 5-minute interactions in the morning that can ruin your whole day? It doesn't take much. Doesn't take much, right? So what we want to do during the calmer times, when our sympathetic nervous system is quieted a little bit and we're not super aroused and scared and angry, is to really try to understand, well, what helps soothe you? And very often we find that what helps soothe the other person is not necessarily what we need ourselves to be soothed. For example, there are many people who let's talk about romantic relationships or spouses or those kinds of relationships. Very often we will gravitate toward and connect with somebody who has a different, what's called attachment style, to our attachment style. Now, attachment styles are something that the psychologists started studying many decades ago, when they looked at, when little kids are upset, what helps to calm them down. And there are some kids who, when they're really upset, they kind of need some space. If you just move in to try to hug them, it's like, that doesn't work. The nature of the relationship is that that's not going to be what soothes them. There are others who very much need you to move in and hug them and hold them. But ideally, they work out something, that there's some way to regulate. And very often, somebody who really needs the hug will wind up partnered with somebody who really needs space when they get dysregulated. And you can easily get into a dance that goes poorly. You can easily get into a dance in which I feel hurt. I need more intimate reassurance when I'm hurt. I move in to try to get the hug. You're hurt. And you need to step back for a bit to re-regulate yourself before you'll be able to come close. I see you stepping back. That triggers my sense of, I'm going to be left out alone on the African savannah. I'm going to be abandoned as a baby. I get even more desperate about bringing you closer. That makes you pull back further. And, we don't do a good job of taking care of one another, under those circumstances. So one form of, and that's just one of many patterns, but one form of inquiry is to really talk to each other about what helps you when you get really upset, when you're losing it, when you're overwhelmed, to start to feel held, to start to feel like, it's okay, sweetheart, to have a sense that Mr. Rogers is with you, or what that inner feeling of it's okay, that allows you to calm down, and then look and see whether we can understand that the breaches are inevitable, but how we help each other re-regulate after the breaches, that we can learn from each other, and we can learn to come back together again.
Mm. So we didn't talk much before this interview, but you've basically outlined my whole life. But anyway, so in
Well,
this
well
place.
we have a lot in common as human beings, I'm afraid.
Yeah, right. And I'm very much guessing many of our audience members are resonating as well. So in this process where we're beginning to, it sounds like, offer some semblance of compassion towards the other person, it seems like the same place that it's good to begin to open to seeing our own habitual patterns, which are so hard to see and are so hard when they're pointed out by that other person. What? Not me, that kind of experience. But how can we, is it possible, and how can we develop more openness for feedback and change and working with our own stuff?
Yeah, at least in my experience, personally and professionally, what most gets in the way of being able to hear feedback is our self-esteem concerns. It's
Mm,
it's 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 the it's the worry that I'm going to feel ashamed. I'm going to feel
mhm,
bad about myself. If the person points out that I do something which is hurtful to them, right? That
right.
because most of us don't want to think of ourselves as hurtful to our partners. Most of us don't want to think of ourselves as disappointing to others, and not just partners, to siblings, to parents, to children. We want other people to think that we're a good person, right? And as a result, we very often start to tense up and resist and get defensive when the person starts to communicate to us that there's something we're doing that they're finding to be problematic. So, this is where mindfulness practices, compassion practices, having some kind of, you can think of it as a spiritual practice or commitment to psychological development really helps. Because what we want to have is a general attitude in the world where, I'd rather be more awake and see more clearly than look good. And
Mm,
very often there's a tension between these two, because to be perfectly honest about what it is to be a human being, it's not very noble. I mean,
kinda messy.
we are these mammals. We have all these different motivational systems
Mm,
that evolved. I mean, basically, there's three broad motivational systems that run the show. One of them is this fight or flight system, right, that we all know, and
mhm,
that's what happens when we get threatened, and we either want to run away and protect ourselves, or we get aggressive. Sometimes, if it's really bad, we might freeze or even collapse. But mostly, it's this kind of fight or flight thing, and that we share with all the other animals, and it goes way back in our evolutionary past. There's our drive system, right? The system where when we're hungry to
mm,
get food, when we're thirsty to get drink, if we have a sexual interest happening, to look for a sexual partner, that kind of drive system, as well as to build a house, to have shelter in the future, and all that. That shared with a lot of other animals too. And then we finally have this other system, which we might call the mammalian tend and befriend system. It's our loving system. It's our cooperative system. It's the system that, as a mom, is activated a lot, right? In terms of just having this natural feeling of wanting to have your kid not suffer, have their basic needs met, having them thrive and be well. And it's this system which typically is most important to activate to keep relationships going, because this is the system that connects us to one another, but it is easily overwhelmed by the other two systems, right? When we're frightened, it's like, sorry, we don't take care of other people's needs so much, when we feel threatened. And often in a relationship, we can feel threatened. And when we're hungry, in some sense, when there's some basic need that we feel has to be met and hasn't being met, that can make us go, that can make our compassionate system go offline as well. So we kind of have to nurture this
mhm,
compassion system because it's so important for our capacity for cooperation. And mindfulness practices, there are studies that show that just learning how to do mindfulness practice does make us more compassionate. We're able to notice our own feelings more and notice the feelings of the other. Compassion practices, where we're explicitly practicing loving kindness toward the other, those kinds of things are helpful. Prayer practices for people who are in more theistic traditions, praying for the welfare of others helps to to nurture this. So there's a lot of ways that we can reinforce this more loving side of us, and just noticing that, we're this kind of primitive mixture of these different forces, all of which made a lot of sense in our evolutionary past for our development. They all have a role today, but that we can get possessed by one or the other, and sometimes we have to guide which one we're going to emphasize in order to support our relationships. And we wind up a lot happier when our relationships are mostly not instrumental, where, what can I get out of you and how can I make sure you meet my needs? And where it's much more, how can we feel connected? How can we see one another more clearly?
Yeah, that's beautiful. It strikes me there's a lot of bravery involved in that question of how can we remain connected.
Yeah, it takes a lot of courage, because it takes a lot of humility, because the self-esteem stuff gets in the way so reliably. If I need to look good and I'm being a jerk, the whole thing's going to fall apart, because I'm not going to admit that I'm being a jerk because I need to look good. Right. And I mean, how many fights have we all had that basically have that as the contour,
Right.
where,
Right. Mm. So speaking of these primary relationships and how we, have this courage and work with ourselves and our partners, what have you learned over the course of your career about really sustaining this kind of love and intimacy over the course of a long-term relationship?
well, forgive me, I'm going to say something that's going to sound very unromantic, and my wife might not even like it. She might think it's too unromantic, even though I'm very nice and I get flowers and all that. I can be very nice on a good day. But thinking that the relationship, and now I'm talking about intimate, romantic, and sexual relationships, thinking that that high that we get at the beginning, when the person who we're idealizing idealizes us back, and so there's all of our problems are solved by that, and there's the wonderful fuel of sexual hormones, so that just seeing the person makes our body respond in a way where we want to be really close, have sexually close. That those forces are so powerful, and they're so pleasurable, that we can easily think that, that's the goal of relationship. It's to have that high, that excitement, that wonderful feeling of being with the beloved. My experience as a clinician and as a human being is that it's pretty tough to sustain that, the same way that it's pretty tough to, cocaine feels really, really good. But if you want to sustain that really good feeling of cocaine, you're going to have a problem, because you're going to wind up a cocaine addict. And every time that the drug wears off, you're going to have a lot of trouble with the other side of it. You're going to have a lot of trouble with the crash. My sense about that kind of passionate romantic love, while it's great, I'm not knocking it, but it's just not like, it's the same way that I think it's, ice cream's wonderful. I really enjoy it, but it's not sustainable.
It melts.
It melts. It melts. Or you finish the ice cream cone and then it's like, well, I can have another, but there are limits to that, right? And, frankly, people who are really desperate to sustain this stuff, they wind up having affairs and stuff to try to keep this feeling going often. And so shifting our expectations and shifting our goal from sustaining that state. I'm not saying not visiting it, not enjoying it when it comes along, or even playing around to jazz it up from time to time. But imagining we can sustain that's a big error in intimate relationships. There's so many people who think there's something wrong with my relationship because I can't sustain that, and then they look for it somewhere else. Whether it's pornography or the affair or something. And seeing instead, how can we be really good friends to each other as our main goal? And how can we nurture this third entity as the relationship? I think that works better. And, there's so much to be learned from our partners. So I've spent decades, studying and teaching mindfulness practices, and I've often given workshops for mental health professionals about this. And I say, early on that when I first started taking up mindfulness practices, I was so impressed by their power. I was tasting my food and really seeing trees and enjoying the present moment and being less preoccupied with the antics of my, at that time, high school girlfriend. And I thought, but that by the time I was old, which since I started as a teenager, I figured was my mid 20s, I'd be hanging around in states of bliss, enjoying the present moment, and everybody would love me. And it hasn't exactly turned out that way. Life has had far more ups and downs than that, even though, we're recording this around Thanksgiving. I'm very grateful that it's been relatively good as human lives go. But I say, I've had the benefit of having had many excellent mindfulness instructors, teachers. And the role of a teacher actually isn't so much to show you techniques, that's easy to learn. It's to help illuminate how the mind creates suffering and how your mind creates suffering for yourself. That's the role of a good teacher. And no teachers were nearly as effective as my twin daughters, particularly when they were adolescents. They were really, really good, at illuminating how the mind creates suffering for itself. And my wife has also been an excellent teacher, by pointing out, every time I act in a way which in some way disappoints or hurts her feelings, it's typically not because she's got crazy, unusual expectations. It's typically because I was anxious, I was distracted, something was going on, and I was not being my best self, and I wasn't talking to her the way I would talk to somebody if I was working with them professionally. I wasn't being so great in that moment, and that kind of feedback becomes enormously, enormously important. Whether it's the humility that comes from wrestling with teenage daughters, or the humility that comes from really hearing your spouse when you say or do something that doesn't work well for them. That's our important teacher. And if we see our goal as lifelong learning this way, rather than our goal being how do I maintain the high of a hormone infused mutual idealization experience. Sorry, I know that sounds terrible for romantic.
It really does.
But that is kind of what it is, that, enjoy, but know what you're playing with here.
Yeah.
If we can shift in that way, I think we wind up with much more sustainable well-being.
Because relationships are so important, clearly they're kind of the central thing that's important in our life in all the different ways and all the different places that we have those relationships. I'm wondering if you could say more about how these healthy relationships, how this connective quality that you're describing, this ability to stay in tune with your partner, this ability to like act as a mirror and give that feedback, how might our audience today enjoy a better quality of life in the coming year?
Yeah. Well, I think a big part of it is valuing relationships. And I know that I've been using, I've been sort of emphasizing intimate relationships as one area, maybe because that's where we're our craziest, but all relationships, friendships at all different levels, collegial relationships. And again, I can't think of how many clients I've had over the years who were sort of, nervous about meeting somebody, nervous about the job interview, nervous about some interpersonal interaction, where they didn't benefit. Or let me not make it a double negative. People benefit enormously when we set an intention to make a connection, and particularly to make a connection, not an impression, right? So often in our relationship world, we're trying to make sure that we look a certain way, that people think a certain way about us, that basically that keeps our self-evaluation intact in some way. And if we can just sort of set that aside and say, all right, yeah, we all have concerns for that. That's built into the primate psyche, but let me focus instead on how do I connect with this other person. It just goes better. It just goes better. Because when we're really trying to connect with the other person, we're not trying to impress them. We're usually much more humble. We're usually taking the risk to tell the other person about our insecurities, our vulnerabilities, what it's really like to be this human being, go through life. One of the things that makes years difficult and makes people feel so lonely is that it's as though we're reading our own reports about if we were a country, we're reading the statistics about poverty and disease and stuff like that, because we all know all of our own suffering, but we're looking at other people's travel brochures, so we wind up thinking that everybody else is having they've got their lives together. I'm a mess. What's wrong with me? And that's simply not a realistic view. It's a friend of mine, Chris Germer, who's done a lot of work with self-compassion, and Chris was quoting a Scottish monk who said that the goal of his monastic practice is to be a compassionate mess. And I love that. The goal is to be a compassionate mess, right? Which means to get it, and admit it to one another, because there's nothing quite like showing other people that we're struggling too in our own way, having a little bit of a sense of humor about it, to make us feel connected to others. And when, looping back to the Harvard study we began with, when we feel connected to others, we just do better.
Yeah. Well, thank you so, so much. Personally, really enjoyed this conversation, and I know that our audience will really enjoy. I'm wondering if you could share, if people want to find you out there, where can they go?
You can go to drronsiegel.com, or if you just Googled my name, Ronald Siegel, Siegel, you'd come up with it. Or another way in is a website, which is mindfulness-solution.com. And, I've done a lot of writing about mindfulness practices and how to use them to work with anxiety, depression, interpersonal relationships, and the like. It's not out yet, but I have a book coming on sort of the futility of trying to build ourselves up as a pathway to well-being, as opposed to connecting to one another. So that'll come eventually. But
does that have a title yet?
No, it doesn't have a title quite yet.
All right. Well, we'll stay tuned.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for your great questions and for your great energy in the interview.
Thanks.